Yeah, so thanks a lot everyone for joining once again. So today we'll have 3 talks by 3 early scientists. And as usual, we just go listen to the 3 talks and then we'll have a round of questions and comments at the end. So if you have any question, just write it down, for example, in the chat, or just keep it in mind for the round of questions at the end. So first we'll have Eric. So Eric is a research scientist at the University of Alaska Fairbanks, and he's focusing on glaciers and periglacial features on Earth and Mars. He has a bachelor's degree in physics, and he obtained his PhD at the University of Texas at Austin. And now he recently has focused on field studies of debris-covered glaciers on Earth. And today he'll be talking about heat flux through supraglacial debris on the Kennecott Glacier in Alaska. Yeah, right. Floor is yours.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, so this is a study that I just recently submitted for consideration at JGR Earth Surface. So this is a new technique that I've developed to look at heat flux through supraglacial debris, in particular to piece out conduction of heat versus convection and non-conductive heat processes. So I think most of us here would agree that debris-covered glaciers are important features to understand. They're very common in high mountain Asia, in Alaska, and in the Andes. And the supraglacial debris moderates the surface melt of the glaciers, which in turn has an impact on downstream communities. Millions of people have fresh water sourced from the melt of debris-covered glaciers. So it's important to understand how that debris affects the melt in order to predict hydrology and cryospheric response to climate change. So a robust way to predict melt under a debris layer is with energy balance modeling. And the traditional way to do this is to assess the energy balance components at the surface of the debris, and then find out the residual, the G, the heat that is conducted into that debris, and then to basically simulate that conduction, assuming that the debris is a purely conductive medium. This is how it's been done in energy balance models used by Reed and Brock, Lindsay Nicholson, David Rounce in his global energy balance work with debris-covered glaciers. But the fact is that this is a somewhat of a simplification. A debris layer, of course, is composed of many clasts of various sizes and has pore space. It has tortuosity. This allows airflow and transmission of water vapor, basically convection, which can introduce its own heat fluxes into the system. There have been a couple of studies that develop models to treat this convection. However, there's very little to no data to show us how much convection to expect and if it's significant. So that's the purpose of this work I'm presenting to you today. And to approach this, I'm using some very humble temperature thermistor sensors placed in the debris in vertical profiles. So with one temperature sensor close to the surface of the debris, one close to the ice debris interface, and then one or more in the center. And this data is for the Kennecott Glacier in Alaska, Southeast Alaska. This is a heavily debris-covered glacier in its lower reaches. We have 3 temperature profiles that we're looking at, 2 of which come from summer of 2020, and 1 of which comes from summer of 2011, each with 2 to 4 temperature sensors in them, and spanning debris depths between 15 and 25 centimeters. So now I'll show some theory, what we're going to be doing with this data. So our ability to change the temperature of a medium of our debris is dependent upon the vertical partial differential of the total heat flux, which we can then split into QC, conductive heat flux, and QNC, non-conductive heat flux. the QC, conductive heat flux, can be written with respect to a differential in Z. And we simplify this equation to produce this final form. And traditionally, what can be done with temperature profile data in superglacial debris is if you ignore the non-conductive part, you can take your data, calculate the differentials, and determine what's called the thermal diffusivity, which wraps together all these thermodynamic properties of the debris so that we can then calculate the conductive heat flux through it. So this is, up until now, this is just standard operating procedure. And I'll show you how that works with some of my well-behaved data. So this is a temperature profile in the Kennecott from 2020. This is 2 temperature sensors. And then we have the ice surface pinned to 0. We calculate these differentials, dt versus the second differential with respect to Z. And you can see that it lines up in a nice linear point cloud. And we can do a linear regression on that, again, using this, this heat transfer equation. And our regression gives us our thermal diffusivity, which is fairly consistent with values found previously in the literature. I've color-coded the points in the scattergram based on the hour of day. So you can see that at midnight, we're close to 0, 0, the origin. And as we go towards noon, we rise in value for each of these differentials. And then in the evening, the afternoon and evening, these differential values fall and then return to 0, 0. So this is again, well-behaved. However, I'll now show you some data where it's less conductive and has more non-conductive processes such as convection taking place. So this is a temperature profile with 4 sensors in it. So we're now able to calculate these differentials for 2 different depths. And these are the scattergrams for those individual depths. On the left, we have 11 centimeters, on the right, 18 centimeters. And this is a 25 centimeter total debris thickness. And you see that it's a bit messier here at both depths. At 11 centimeters, the data seems to be a little bit all over the place. There's almost these 2 modes perhaps going on. But the very interesting thing at 18 centimeters is this elliptical point cloud. And if you look at the hour of day shading that I've put on the plot, you can see that this elliptical cloud is inscribed by that diurnal motion. So as we climb to about noon, we get maxima in the differentials. And then as we descend in the afternoon, we descend with this residual in dt based upon values of a second derivative with respect to Z. So looking at this, this diurnal cycle, we can then, to make our fit better for our conductive component, for our thermal diffusivity, we can filter this data to basically focus on the lower part of this curve. So this is hours between midnight and 7 a.m. And for this area, it's linear through the origin, and we get a better fit for our thermal diffusivity. But now here's where it becomes interesting, is we can say this lower part of the curve is conductive behavior, and then this residual is non-conductive behavior. This is when convection perhaps is occurring within the debris layer. And perhaps we can pull a signal out of that residual. So let's go back to our equations here, where we ignored the non-conductive heat flux. And now let's no longer ignore it. Let's bring it back. So we've determined our thermal diffusivity here, this kappa E. We've calculated our differentials with respect to temperature. So what we can do is take or calculate our dq, nc, dz this differential of non-conductive heat flux as the residual between our calculated dT/dt and our modeled dT/dt, assuming that there's no non-conductive behavior going on. And then, of course, we need to integrate over our differential to come up with our constraint on non-conductive heat flux. And in order to get values for the QNC, we do need to impose a boundary condition. And the boundary condition we're going to impose here for this study is that QNC is 0 at the debris-ice interface. So here's an animation that will pull all of this together. On the far left, we have the temperature profile data. So depth on the y-axis, temperature on the x-axis. On the far right now, these are scattergrams of the temperature differentials at 11 and 18 centimeters. This red line, this red dashed line, is the line that passes through the origin and is our conductive behavior line. When the data points are along that line, we have a fairly conductive debris layer, and when they deviate, we have non-conductive behavior. The residual from this will be used to calculate the dq/dz in the middle panel. And then on the right panel, we have our heat flux components. In blue is the conductive heat flux, green is non-conductive heat flux, derived using my new method here. And then in black is the total heat flux. So we'll go ahead and play this video. So you can see we get these excursions from the conductive behavior at 18 centimeters, and that produces our non-conductive heat flux. And we get days with different, basically different magnitudes of that excursion. We get larger circles inscribed corresponding to larger heat flux values, and then smaller circles corresponding to lesser values of this non-conductive heat flux. And things are complicated at 11 centimeters, where in the morning, we tend to get some excursions above that line. And then in the evening, we get excursions below that line. And that turns into a change in sign of the non-conductive heat flux in the afternoon. That's all a lot to digest right now. So we'll go to a time series. This is the time series for that differential produced from the deviation from conduction or from conductive behavior. And here I've plotted it along with shortwave radiation obtained by nearby weather stations. And you can see that the magnitude of this differential depends on the atmospheric conditions. On sunny days, we get high values, and on cloudy days, we get lower values. So now let's take a look at the actual heat flux components. So this is QC is conductive heat flux in the top panel. QNC is the non-conductive heat flux in the middle panel. And then we get the sum of the heat fluxes, Q total, in the bottom panel. The scale on QC and QNC is the same. So you can see that QNC tends to have more dramatic peaks, but narrower than in QC. And again, sunny versus cloudy days, you get higher magnitude of heat flux, both in conductive and non-conductive on the sunny versus the cloudy days. Here is a mean diurnal cycle of those heat fluxes. So you can see that behavior a little bit easier The solid lines are the conductive heat flux, and dashed lines are non-conductive heat flux for 7.5 centimeters and 14.5 at blue is 7.5, orange is 14.5. And you can see that that change in sign at in the middle or in the upper part of the profile manifest in this diurnal cycle here. So we get a high peak in QNC, and then it drops off very quickly, whereas QNC persists in the afternoon. Whereas that behavior is not as apparent deeper in the profile. Now, what may be happening here is that this heat flux is going into drying the debris layer at this level. And as we get complete drying of the debris layer at that level, it drops to change sign. So I have to wrap up now here, but just really quickly, when we analyzed data from 2011 using different sensors, slightly different part of the glacier, we found similar behavior in the scattergrams and similar patterns in the heat fluxes, although with some more dramatic values of the non-conductive heat flux, even exceeding the conductive heat flux. And yeah, so what can be driving this non-conductive heat flux? Radiation penetration of the upper few centimeters is something that's been known to occur in Antarctica. But I think mostly what's going on here is convection and latent heat flux. Basically, I would compare it to a swamp cooler effect. Swamp coolers basically are used to cool apartments by drawing hot, dry air over a film of water, and that evaporation creates a heat flux, which then cools that air. And I think what's happening here is we're getting meltwater wicking upward through the debris, and airflow through those pores then causes latent heat flux evaporation, and that is basically taking away energy that otherwise would be available for conduction and ice melt. And looking in the literature, we do see similar shapes of scattergrams. So this is Nicholson and Ben's work. I think we see a very similar elliptical shape. These authors did note the scatter and attributed it to non-conductive heat flux, but until now, no one's identified this diurnal cycle that can be turned into a signal. So I'll wrap up now. Basically, we can start to measure this non-conductive heat flux, try to understand where it's coming from. And I think the next steps are to figure out how to incorporate it into models. And so with that, I'll wrap up and turn it over to the next speaker.
Awesome, thanks a lot. So just to recall, we'll go through all the questions at the end of the 3 talks and move on to Ewa. So Ewa recently finished her PhD at Cardiff University. In her PhD, she was investigating the microbiology of glaciers in the unique habitat of cryoconite holes. She's now currently a postdoc at the University of Warsaw in Poland, and she's working on the use of bacteria in bioremediation of contaminated soils and waters. And today she'll be talking about anaerobic biogeochemistry of cryoconite holes. Falls is yours. You're muted, I think.
Okay, now?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. Okay, so hello everyone. I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the picture on the front is not donut as my husband thought, but it's a cryoconite hole view from the top. And I will just quickly introduce myself again, because I've just finished PhD in glacial microbiology. And I am currently a postdoc doing purely biological stuff, but I am open to any collaboration on the verge of glaciology and microbiology. So if anyone is interested, please get in touch. And now over to cryoconite holes and cryoconite material. So I would like to begin with telling you why most people are interested in them. And the main two reasons are the contribution to the darkening of the glaciers. So together with famous glacial algae on the left here, cryoconite holes in the ice, which are, as you can see, very dark, contribute to the darkening, which can be also seen from the satellite. And they also contribute to the carbon cycling, and I will get more into that in my talk. But what are they? So they are this little oasis for microbiological life on ice, and you can find them all over the world. They are water-filled depressions in ice, and they have some sediment on the bottom. Here is a very dark sediment. Here is more brown. It can be in the form of loose sediment. It can be in the form of hairy granules, as this with these cyanobacterial filaments. It can be really nice and round granules, as in Svalbard. So they are very diverse. And not only they contribute to the darkening, but they also contribute to the runoff of different nutrients to the downstream environments. They are created when we have a bit of dust which falls on the surface, and then microorganisms colonize it, and all of this dark material melts into the ice, creating a hole. So very simple environment. And my study sites were in Greenland, Svalbard, and Antarctica, and I also got a bit of material from Italy. And I'm interested in biology. So specifically, I'm interested in the influence of the little guys which live in these holes on the rest of the glacial ecosystem. More specifically, I'm interested in heterotrophic bacteria, so bacteria which eat what phototrophic bacteria such as cyanobacteria or what algae are producing. And during my PhD, I discovered that even though these holes are often open to atmosphere and quite connected to the air and they have access to the oxygen, if you go deeper into the sediment, the oxygen is depleted and they live without oxygen. And you might wonder, why would we even care about such a thing like lack of the oxygen in the sediment? But that's because of the way the organic matter is degraded in conditions with oxygen versus the conditions without oxygen. So if we have oxygen here on the left, the complex organic matter is first degraded into less complex building bricks, let's say, such as sugars or different amino acids and stuff. And this is quite easily degraded and respired by aerobic bacteria into CO2. But if we have anaerobic conditions, so we don't have oxygen, these building bricks are more complex to be degraded. We don't have this great electron acceptors such as oxygen. So we get all kinds of different metabolisms, such as fermentation, for example. And this creates a range of compounds which can be later released downstream, or they have to be processed further. So in the center here, you have acetate, and it's an intermediate metabolite in many processes, many anaerobic processes. So we used it to check for these anaerobic processes in the sediments. And I did some literature search to check if we get this acetate as a proxy for anaerobic metabolism found on glacial surfaces in various places on Earth. And mostly it's below 2 micromoles per liter, so it's not very high concentrations. And we did some field measurements in cryoconite water as well. And you can see that it's pretty low in Greenland and maybe a bit higher in Italy, but it's not very impressive when you compare it to our cryoconite samples. So when you take cryoconite sample home, which is what we like to do from every field work, I bring some home, I bring some to the lab, we keep them in the freezers everywhere. And then I defrosted them because you have to transport them in a way that preserves microbiological life, and freezing is the best way. And when I defrosted them, I got really high concentrations of acetate. So that was interesting for me. What's happening here that we have so much in the defrosted samples and we don't find that much in the field? I started investigating this phenomenon, and first I took biological approach. So I got bacteria from cryoconite, pure cultures of one bacterial type on these special plates. And then I checked if they can produce acetate and if they can ferment any other things. And indeed, this graph here shows you just that yes, they can. In the culture, they produce a lot. And there is a lot of different types which can do it. So then I wanted to try to mimic the field conditions and check if I can produce this acetate with cryoconite hull by myself. So I did two things. I did incubations in these vessels, these artificial cryoconite hulls. I did it in the field, and I did it later in the lab. And when I incubated them in the field for just 20 days, I got quite a lot of acetate. So as you remember, in the literature, I had like around maybe 2 micromoles. Here I reached 200 after 20 days. And this was done in Greenland. And then I took this sediment to the lab as well. And I incubated it for a very, very long time. And in the sediment from Antarctica, from Svalbard, and from Greenland, after 35 days, in all of them, we get quite a lot of acetate. And if we keep it longer, we mostly get even more acetate with time. So that is interesting why it happens, because, okay, if we get so much, it has to be released somewhere. But what's going on? Why is it not used up? And here on this graph, again, you can see that the guys who eat acetate are sulfate reducers and methanogens. So I just wanted to check what's happening with the guys who are supposed to eat the acetate in cryoconite hulls. And sulfate reducers need sulfate as an electron acceptor while they eat acetate. And we see that with time, we get a reduction of sulfate in the sediment, which likely means that sulfate reduction is happening and that we get some consumption of acetate, but the amount of sulfate which we get in cryoconite hull is not that big. So that's one reason why maybe we get a higher amount of acetate being produced and being eaten up, that we don't have enough sulfate and we don't have enough these bacteria which can reduce sulfate. As for methane, I don't know. We haven't measured this, so I don't actually know if there are any studies on the surface of the glaciers about the release of methane. So I will welcome your contribution about it if somebody knows about any studies. I haven't heard of anyone measuring methane in cryoconite hulls. But I did another approach. So we checked the DNA data from the sediment, and we checked for the groups of bacteria and other microorganisms which are known to either produce methane, so methanogens, which eat acetate and produce methane. And we get some methanogens in only one particular example from Greenland margin, which likely has some subglacial sediment mixed into the system as well. So these methanogens might be coming from subglacial environment, which is known for methanogenesis. And as for sulfate reducers, we do get some in most of the samples. You can see that the pattern is quite sketchy. We get more in some samples, we get less or zero in some other samples, which might explain the variability between the sites. And it might also explain the variability which we observed between samples. And also, it's not a lot. So whatever you see here in this DNA data, it's the abundance of these guys compared to other groups of bacteria, it's just not a lot. So my explanation for the acetate and this anaerobic metabolism happening in cryoconite holes is that this metabolism is in balance. So normally in the environment, you have the loop, which is well balanced. You get whatever is produced is being eaten up. But here, for some reason, the balance is not really there. And I'm still puzzling over the difference between my incubations and whatever we observe in situ. So that's one of my remaining questions. But the simple explanation is that just in the field, the water flow is diluting the acetate being produced. So because when I incubate them, I obviously don't get a water flow. I don't observe this effect. But in the field, even though if these holes look pretty isolated, there are some hydrological connections with the rest of the system. And the other questions, which I think are good for the future and which I keep asking myself is, does it really matter? Are these anaerobic zones in the sediment big enough to contribute enough to the nutrients runoff? When are they important? So I think they're important in the late summer and early spring, where we have little flow or no water flow, and these anaerobic zones can really develop and they are not diluted. This anaerobic metabolism can be very important in ice veins in winter, because then you don't get oxygen input. So they are probably living there without oxygen. And the questions which we still also don't have answers to is how much of the glaciers are covered with cryoconite. We don't know if there will be more cryoconite in the future. So if this special metabolism, this anaerobic metabolism will be bigger or smaller. But surely it does affect the composition of the dissolved organic carbon being released from the glaciers. It does contribute to the carbon cycling. So I think it's important to understand what's going on, and it's important to see all these processes, even the scale might seem really small when we look at them individually. So just to wrap up, I studied that this anaerobic metabolism seemed to be an important part of cryoconite. I noticed that the acetate, which is a proxy for anaerobic metabolism, can be detected in situ, but in little amounts. But there is a lot if we defrost the sample or if we incubate the sample of cryoconite sediment. And the consumers of acetate are present, but they are present in low abundances, which might explain the imbalanced habitat. And water flow likely dilutes the concentrations we observe in situ. And as I mentioned, the magnitude and the impact on the ecosystem remains still unknown. And with this, I would like to invite the next speaker and chat with you during the question session.
Great, thank you a lot, Eva. So yeah, do not hesitate to write down questions in the chat, and let's move on to our last speaker, who is Suryanarayanan. He did his master's in mathematics and then started to volunteer and manage and do research for the Icestupa project, the Himalayas. He's now continuing his research as a PhD student at the University of Fribourg in Switzerland. And he also loves to conduct science workshops for children and has engaged with several schools in India to advance the cause of child rights. And today he will be talking about the weather conditions for Icestupa growth.
Thank you, Adrian. I hope everyone can hear me. Okay. So today I want to talk to you about a new water storage technology. This is called artificial ice reservoirs, or popularly called Icestupas. Just last winter, farmers in Kyrgyzstan, Chile, and India used this technology for their irrigation water supply. Why? Because they didn't need any energy, expertise, funding, or equipment to make these ice structures. This technology was invented in Ladakh, a high altitude desert in northern India. It lies in the rain shadow of the Himalayas and receives less than 10 centimeters of rain or snow per year. As glaciers decline due to climate change, regional water scarcity is increasing. And so, farmers here have resorted to these ice reservoirs as insurance against this uncertainty. In the past, these ice reservoirs were very difficult to make. They had to be made in high altitudes and they were made as ice sheets. But now they are made like these ice cones, and these can be built where the water is needed the most, right in the outskirts of the villages near the fields of the farmers. In the last 3 winters alone, more than 500 farmers have built around 50 Icestupas, storing around 120 million liters of water in 26 villages just in Ladakh. Together with Himalayan Institute of Alternatives, I have been working with these farmers for the past 6 years. But even now, whenever we build an Icestupa in a new location, we never know what to expect. Will this Icestupa grow big enough to break our old records, or will it not even survive the heat of the next day? I have often wondered whether Icestupas are a good way to achieve winter water storage. Watching the Icestupa freeze in the winter, I wonder how much of the water we spray is actually freezing or ending up in a puddle somewhere. Watching the Icestupa melt under the summer sun, I wonder how much of the water we froze is evaporating back into the atmosphere. Moreover, the key innovation, that is the shape of the Icestupa as a cone, is not very clear. Of course, a cone has a lesser surface area than the ice sheets that were made before, but that means also a lesser freezing. The surface area is a double-edged sword. It both decreases melting but also decreases freezing at the same time. These were the questions I came with when I joined my PhD in the University of Fribourg. Here we developed a Python model and a measurement strategy to capture the ice volume evolution of these ice structures. Just last winter, we were able to measure using weather stations, drones, and flow meters 2 Icestupas built simultaneously in Switzerland and India, as shown here. These two locations are drastically different. The Indian location was much higher in altitude compared to the Swiss location. The temperature of the Indian location was like 2 degrees colder than the Swiss location. The Indian location was also drier than the Swiss location, and it had around 2 times higher solar radiation than the Swiss location. The fountains used in both these locations are also drastically different. The Indian fountain had roughly around 7 times higher discharge rate than the Swiss fountain, and it was also it had a runtime of around half that of the Swiss fountain. We also defined something called as a spray radius of the fountain to understand that. Let's have a bird's eye look of the Swiss Icestupa. Here you see quite clearly how the water droplets from the fountain created the perimeter of the ice structure, as shown here, and this is what we call the spray radius of the Icestupa. In the Swiss Icestupa's case, it was around 7 meters, and in the Indian case, it was 3 meters higher, around 10 meters. And why is this important? Because this is used as a model input. In the Python model, we use the simplistic assumption that the Icestupa is a cone is in the shape of a cone, and during the time period when the fountain is on, the ice radius is assumed to be equal to the spray radius. And so the model only has to evaluate what is the height of the cone at every time step. And then when the fountain is switched off, the model assumes the slope of the cone is constant and melts the ice cone accordingly. The energy balance acts on a surface layer of this ice cone, which is like around 5 millimeters thick in this case, and this is where the model computes all the energy balance components, and all the freezing, melting, and sublimation happens in an hourly time step. Now we go into the mass balance input of both the locations. Most of the water came, mass input in the terms of water came from the fountain, both in the Indian location and Swiss location, but there was considerable contribution of precipitation also in the Swiss location, but there was none in the Indian location. Now we go into the drone data that was obtained by the different teams in Switzerland and India. Here you see the top half of the figure is the Swiss location, and the bottom half is the Indian location with its 6 drone measurements, and the Swiss location had around 8 drone measurements. The first drone measurement is actually represented in the y-axis in the bottom. In this case, in the Swiss location, the first drone measurement was taken when there was no ice present. So here the 13-meter cube represents the twigs, the tree branches that surrounded the fountain. In the Indian location, there was already an ice reservoir quite in close proximity, and which eventually merged into this new Icestupa. So the first drone measurement captured the volume of the old ice reservoir, and that's where the ice evolution starts. Now we see how the model was able to estimate these validate these drone measurements just using the weather and water data from the fountain and the weather station. So here you see the validation of the drone measurements, which was done by the model. And yes, it kind of worked. And so we move on to the results of the mass balance output according to the model. So what you see here is that the biggest fraction of the mass balance output is in the terms of fountain runoff. This is quite unfortunate because this means most of the water that emerged out of the fountain never interacted with the ice cone and rather just flowed away. And so this is a water loss component. And together with the vapor fraction, this means that the water loss in the Indian location was around 80%, whereas in the Swiss location it was around 78%. And this, putting it in perspective, the water sprayed in the Swiss location was around 8 liters per minute for 2,200 hours. The mean freezing rate, though, according to the model, was only 1 liter per minute. The maximum freezing rate was only 8 liter per minute. So it did reach at certain times, all the water from the fountain was used. But this time period was only around 6 hours out of the 2,200 hours possible. In the Indian locations case, the story is quite similar. The water sprayed was higher at 60 liters per minute for a lower time for around 830 hours. The mean freezing rate was only 14 liters per minute, but also the maximum freezing rate was only half that of the discharge. So most of the water in the sprayed from the fountain was actually being wasted, even in the Indian location. Now we understand why the mean freezing rate, for example, in the India location was 14 liters per minute. In the Swiss location, it was around 1 liter per minute. Why was this mean freezing rate in these two different locations so drastically different, around 14 times higher in the Indian location compared to the Swiss? To do that, we first divide the whole time period of both the Icestupas into accumulation and ablation period. Accumulation means basically the time period when the fountain was active. So in the Swiss location, it looks like this, and the Indian location, it looks like this. Now we compare the energy components in both these time periods to understand why the magnitude of the freezing rate was so drastically different. To do that, first we divide all the energy balance input into melting energy or freezing energy. How do we do that? We approximate. So basically, the short wave radiation basically represents the process of day melt. So this can be thought of as a melting energy component. The long wave radiation is basically contributing to the freezing energy. It can be thought of as a night freeze component. The sensible heat is conduction. It also contributes to both. It contributes both to melting and freezing energy, but predominantly, according to the model, it contributes to the melting energy during the accumulation period. The latent heat, again, according to the model, predominantly was the process of sublimation, and it contributed to the freezing energy. Now we have, as we have represented all the energy balance input into melting and freezing fractions, we can now go into the magnitude of all the components. So here you see the day melt, night freeze, conduction, sublimation components, and the mean values, energy balance values of all these processes compared for both the locations. To first go into the day melt component, you see the day melt component is not, that is the short wave radiation, is not melting both the Icestupas that much. Why? Because to understand that, we first have to understand how the shape of the Icestupa is contributing to the reduced effect of the solar radiation. So the solar radiation impact, solar radiation does not impact the whole surface area. Particularly the direct component of the solar radiation only sees a cross section or a triangle. The horizontal component of the direct solar radiation sees a triangle of or a cross section of the surface area, and the vertical component of the direct solar radiation sees a half circle. And so in total, only 30% of the total total surface area is being impacted by the solar radiation, less than 30%. But why is the day melt in both the Indian and Swiss locations so drastically different? Roughly, the day melt in this Indian location was only half that of the Swiss. But remember, the input the solar radiation input in the Indian location was twice that of the Swiss location. To understand this, we have to understand how the direct and diffuse fractions were at both these locations. In the Indian location, because it was they had mostly clear skies, there was most of the solar radiation was in the form of direct solar radiation, whereas in the Swiss location, roughly half the days were cloudy. So half the solar radiation fraction was in the form of diffuse solar radiation. And so because they were half the number of days in the Swiss location were cloudy, the total solar radiation impact in the Swiss location was so drastically higher compared to the Indian location. Now we go into the sublimation process. So the sublimation is quite interesting because there is a huge discrepancy in terms of mass balance and energy balance. So what I mean by that is sublimating 1 ton of ice equivalent in energy to freezing 9 tons of water. So what this means in terms of energy or mass loss is, in the Indian Icestupa's case, the sublimation mass loss was accounted for around 41 tons of water, whereas this corresponds to around 21% of the total freezing energy. Whereas in the Swiss Icestupa's case, the sublimation mass loss was only around 5 tons, and this contributed only around 8% of the total freezing energy of the energy balance. So now so now that we have seen, so the day melt in the Indian location, because the day melt in the Indian location was only half that of the Swiss location, and because sublimation was 5 times higher compared to the Swiss location, the Indian location had was much more favorable for Icestupa growth. And of course, we should not forget the contribution of the surface area. Here, when I say what I mean by surface area is basically it can be attributed to the spray radius of the fountain, because as I initially described, in the accumulation period, the ice radius is equal to the spray radius, and surface area is proportional to square of the radius. So the fountain spray radius is directly responsible to for the surface area, or the surface area difference in both the locations. So so the fountain is very interesting in the way that you can see it as a way of optimization. As we saw, around 80% of water in both the locations is being lost. So the fountain discharge rate could have been, for example, halved to increase the efficiency of the whole construction process. Another interesting way to increase the efficiency or reduce the water loss is to increase the spray radius, because by increasing the spray radius, we are effectively increasing the freezing rate. And so the fountain can be used in both these ways to increase the efficiency of the whole construction process. So in summary, both the Indian and the Swiss locations had high water losses, but water loss reduction is possible by decreasing the discharge rate or increasing the spray radius. The maximum ice volume of the Indian ice reservoir was more than 8 times higher than the Swiss due to lower day melt and higher sublimation. So this technology, in summary, is ideally suited to serve as a water management strategy, especially in colder and less cloudy regions. I would like to thank all the partners, research partners and implementation partners that made this whole campaign, this winter campaign possible. And I would like to share my email. If anyone has questions, I'm open to collaborations also. And also, I would like to introduce the next week's speaker. Yeah, thank you.
Awesome, thanks a lot. So yeah, thanks a lot to the three of you, and let's open the floor for questions. You can just raise your hand on Zoom or write it down, and can. Paco has a question. Do you want to say it out loud, maybe, or?
Yes, hello.
Hello.
Thanks to all for your nice presentations. Were all of them nice, and a variety of them. I'm just curious. I have a question I wrote for Ewa, and it's related to this. She mentioned at the beginning of the presentation about the contribution of these cryoconite holes and also the algae to the darkening of the glacier surface, and this implies a decrease in the albedo. And then I'm just curious about, I know this is not exactly your field, but maybe you are familiar with that. I would like to know whether you know by how much these cryoconite holes can decrease the albedo, some value, some percent for typical cases or extreme cases that you could know reported in any paper.
So I don't know if it's been reported anywhere, but we did some measurements in Greenland. And as you've seen on the pictures, the Greenland ones are really dark and quite deep. And they, if you measure albedo reduction in the whole, it's 97%. So it's almost complete compared to the ice. But yeah, the problem which remains to be solved is how much ice is actually covered by the holes, and the reports of the coverage are quite different for different glaciers, ranging from like 3% to 30% of the glacier being covered by the holes. So it's still hard to estimate how much they actually contribute.
Okay.
Yeah, but if you get the Greenland cryoconite hole, it can decrease up to 97%. So
No, I guess, I mean, in the hole itself, but I was wondering about considering, for instance, a whole glacier and the total amount or distribution of the holes, by how much?
So yeah,
total,
this we don't
like
know.
20%, 30%, 10%. Okay.
It varies a lot. Yeah, we don't know.
Okay, thanks.
Great, thanks. So there's a question from Andre. Do you want to unmute yourself as well? I can just read it as well. So Andre was asking what happened with the heat fluxes on rainy days, Eric.
Yeah, so I won't say those are necessarily rainy days so much as overcast days. So what's going on there is that the surface energy balance in general is a lot muted. So you have less shortwave radiation heating the surface of the debris. The debris is less hot, so you get less long wave transmission and less sensible heat fluxes. And so that all translates into less conductive heat flux and less meltwater, less convection in the debris. And it looks like Roger has a question too. It sounds like he maybe should unmute himself.
Yeah.
For more.
Hello,
more
Eric.
specifics.
Thanks very much for that. I was just interested in whether you had any control on the porosity, the fluid content, the water levels, or anything at the sites you did. I'm sure they were opportunistic to get your heat flow measurements working well, but it would be wonderful to think that there was a site that had a flat enough surface you could leave a maybe continuously recording resistivity tomography survey going to see how any water level and fluid changed over time.
Yeah, that's a great idea to think about incorporating geophysics. Yeah, most of my data comes from opportunistic, trying to find the best site that's the most stable, but having difficulty thinking about how to measure these things right now, because the debris is not particularly static either. It tends to move and kind of sort itself as the ice melts underneath. So some of my instruments end up getting moved around, and I can't use the full data set. But yeah, some things I'm thinking about are like putting in some plaster and pulling out the debris to get a better idea of the porosity and tortuosity. And then, yeah, I really want to talk to more soil scientists who might help with measuring some of these things, like the water content.
Yeah,
So,
thanks very much. That sounds very promising. A lot of interesting ideas there. You know, engineering site geophysicists will be quite good on that. There's a couple of good companies operating in Alaska who I can dig up names from as well if you want to get in touch.
that would be great. Yeah, I'll send you.
Cheers. Thanks very much.
Great, thanks. We'd have a comment from Stefan.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Right. Right, I have an answer to Francisco's question about the albedo. I worked with Carl Buchgild in Northeast Greenland in the ablation zone with Rich Brandt. We measured albedo and we found some areas where the debris was uniformly distributed, and right next to it, it was instead aggregated and concentrated into cryoconite holes. And the albedo was lower when it was uniformly distributed, because when it gets concentrated in the cryoconite holes, the ice melts down because of the darker cryoconite, and so the cryoconite material sort of hides itself down in the hole. And we got an average of about 30% albedo. I guess that's spectrally average, yeah, for uniform debris, whereas the area of ice with the cryoconite holes is about 60%. The holes themselves are very dark, but it was a small fraction of the total area. And that we published Journal of Glaciology 2010.
Okay, thanks. I will check out that paper.
Great, thanks a lot. I'll just check on Facebook if you have any questions.
No, there doesn't seem to be any there actually today.
I would have a follow-up then for Eric. Do you expect, if you have now like 20 more profiles, what would you expect? Do you expect many more different regimes, or the two main ones that you showed, so following the activity or like kind of circling around, would be still like the two main ones?
Wait, could you repeat the first part of that question again?
Yeah, sorry. I was just wondering if you would have like, I know, 20 more profiles or like a lot of different profiles on your glacier, would you expect like more different regimes than what you showed here, which is like the two main ones where it's following the connectivity or like coming back at midnight?
Yeah, I definitely would expect it to get complicated, particularly as we go to thicker debris and maybe different debris properties. If you have a lot more large class and larger pore space, I could see that changing the dynamics of the convection, and that's some of the next steps that I'm working on now. Is I have data from this summer that I've just started looking at, and yeah, it's getting more complicated. So stay tuned, and we'll have some more different regimes and try to fit that in with the energy balance.
Great, thanks. And can you actually quantify the porosity somehow, or like more than visual analysis when you're in the field? But could you somehow to validate that you don't get high porosity when you have when it's following the connectivity?
There's ways to do it. But it's difficult to do it in the field. Come to the debris and say, this plot here where I'm installing my sensors is X percent. I think one of the options is putting in some cement, pulling out a segment of debris, and then measuring the ratio of your cement to your debris volume, or just taking a sample of debris back to the lab and putting it on a block of ice and kind of melting it, let it sort itself naturally, and see what turns out. But this is all just stuff that I'm thinking about and haven't tried yet. If anyone here has experience with measuring porosity and things like moraine, I'd be happy to talk.
Great, thanks a lot. So yeah, don't hesitate if you have any more questions. Oh, Hester would have one. Do you want to mute yourself, Hester?
Yeah, hi, Suryanarayan.
Yes.
I saw in one of your tables that at night in India there's much lower long wave radiation than in Switzerland. So I was wondering if the cold storage overnight makes a large difference in the total energy balance and how you measure or model that.
So the reason why the longer radiation is much more higher in magnitude than in the Swiss location is primarily because of the temperature difference. So the air temperature is 2 degrees Celsius colder, and secondarily it's also because of the cloudiness. So because lower cloudiness also enhances the longer radiation. So that way, those are the two primary reasons why there is a big difference in longer in the night freezing effect. Yeah. Did I answer your question, or?
So my question in a way is, do you account for that for having to warm up your ice to 0 degrees again before you start melting it?
Yeah, I do. Yes.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Great, thanks a lot. Yeah, just waiting a bit more to see if we get more questions. Someone straight in. Yeah, Andre, you want to unmute yourself as well?
Yeah.
Yes, now I can unmute myself. So thank you for all presentations, are very interesting. I have only two small comments. One about the methane. I remember some days ago I heard a presentation about the methane emission from the glacier surface with cryoconite and without. So I tried to find the reference and send to you, Ewa, if you don't mind.
That would be great, yeah.
And the second about the Stupas. I also remember there are many experiments 30 or 40 years ago in our country, in Russia, to produce artificial fern with sprinklers.
Mm-hmm.
And there are many empirical data and so on for many purposes to build artificial, well, bridge and many other things. And as I remember, the strong effect is this wind.
Yes.
And if you make a rotating sprinkler, it might increase the productivity.
Yes.
Because
yes.
you just replace the wind
Yes.
by rotation and you catch the cold from
Yes.
a larger volume. So,
yes,
there are many data on this. So
yes.
very interesting.
Yes.
So thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you a lot again.
Okay.
Oh yeah, did
Okay.
you just read the question?
Yes, I read the question.
Right.
So how much does the wind distort and disrupt the spray radius? Okay. So yeah, this is yeah, the wind does so when I say the spray radius, what I mean is the average. So how we calculate the spray radius is through the drone measurements. So the drone measurements, from the drone measurements, we know the perimeter of the ice structure. So and from that perimeter, we know how the fountain has created the or what is the spray radius of the fountain. This is not from first principles. We are not calculating the trajectory of the water droplets to calculate the spray radius. That's also another methodology to do that, but that's not what we are doing here. So to answer your question, yes, the spray radius does distort the wind, is distorted by the wind, but because our methodology does not use the water droplet trajectory, this is ignored basically.
Great, thanks. Some last questions. Checking Facebook as well. There's no questions on Facebook. Otherwise, yeah, I'd like to thank you, all three of you, for those very nice talks. And yeah, just waiting just a few more seconds just to see the last questions. Yeah. Otherwise, yeah, thank you a lot everyone for joining as well, and see you next week. And yeah, you just showed the speaker for next week. So yeah, see you there and have a nice week.
Yeah, and apologies to everyone for my technical difficulties at the start.
Thank you a lot.